Science is supposed to be about the pursuit of truth. But what happens when ambition, greed, and outright fraud infect that pursuit, especially in a field as high stakes as Alzheimer's research? In this episode of Freerange MD, I'm joined by investigative journalist Charles Pillar, author of the blockbuster new book, Doctored: Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's. His reporting uncovers a shocking story, one where careers, billions in funding, and the hopes of millions hinged on research that was in part built on lies. This isn't just about bad science, however. It's about how deeply entrenched systems of prestige and power can shake the very core of medical progress. Doctored is a must-read, and if you think scientific fraud like this is rare or harmless, think again. Stay with me and listen. You won't believe what Charles has uncovered here, and I hope you enjoy it. Charles Pillar, welcome to Free Range MD.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian.
So, Charles, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I am an investigative journalist and have been doing this sort of work for a long time for big newspapers and then for STAT, which is a medical and science website that people may have heard of and read some things on. And then in the last few years for Science Magazine, which of course is one of the preeminent scientific scholarly journals, but we have a journalism side of the book, and that's the part I work for.
Yeah, and I just want to make it clear that to listeners that Charles is a very serious investigative journalist. Science is, again, just to echo what he said, one of the premier journals in the world, and so that really helps establish some of the credibility to what we're discussing. So, everything we're talking about today centers on Alzheimer's, which is a disease that, as listeners may know, affects nearly 7 million Americans, 1 out of 9 people over age 65, making it a huge cause of death. I guess over the past decades, from reading your material, Charles, we've realized some real advances in heart disease and cancer, but yet Alzheimer's, we've kind of not made the advances that we would have liked. And I guess you have investigated some of what's been happening with Alzheimer's research, and tell us a little bit about the doctored story and how you got into this.
Sure. Happy to do that, Brian. Perhaps it would be beneficial to first start kind of at the beginning of Alzheimer's disease to provide a little bit of context for how I stepped into this. So, and I appreciate your comments about how Alzheimer's diverges in the experience from other terrible diseases like heart disease and cancer. And fundamentally, well, just to take us back to the beginning, the disease was, if you will, found for the first time, or at least identified specifically by this German scientist, Alzheimer, the namesake, in 1906. And what he found was this combination of characteristics from an autopsy he did of the brain of a woman who had serious dementia. He found 2 types of proteins in her brain that were regarded as characteristic of people who had these dementia symptoms. One is the so-called sticky plaques that people may have heard of. These are amyloid beta proteins, and also the so-called tangles. These are called tau proteins. Tau proteins inside the nerve cells, plaques and other forms of amyloid protein outside the nerve cells, but within the brain. And he basically decided that the combination of plaques, tangles, and dementia is Alzheimer's disease. He didn't name it after himself, but it was later named after him. So this was very important and interesting, but not something that medical scientists went after in a really wholehearted way with intensive research for decades. And the reason is a simple demographic one. Not that many people until the 50s, 60s, 70s were starting to live to old age when the symptoms of Alzheimer's normally have their onset. But by the 60s, 70s, our lifespans were much longer, in part due to medical advances. Everything from vaccines to treatments for heart disease and cancer. People were living longer lives, and therefore many were getting the symptoms of Alzheimer's late in life. So a lot of intensive work was thrown into this disease. So the difficulty of it is that unlike cancer and heart disease, unlike diabetes, unlike stroke, there have been no remedies developed for Alzheimer's that either arrest or reverse the cognitive decline of the disease. So it's a very challenging, tragic, and heartbreaking kind of situation, because patients and families know that there's nothing out there right now that we know for sure can have those really beneficial effects that we do see with other dread diseases. So if you will, I now can jump back into the story of how I got into this. Would that be good now, Brian?
Yeah, no, that's some great context for this. And it just, I think you've laid out the idea that this is something that's really kind of come into its own more recently.
Yeah, absolutely. So back in 2021, I was working on a research associated with an Alzheimer's drug called Simufulum by a company named Cassava Sciences. And that is a whole long, and I would, sorry to say, kind of sordid tale. That drug has recently crashed and burned. It's no longer being developed as a remedy for Alzheimer's disease, but it went through a long metamorphosis from great hope to great disappointment. And it's a story of apparent image doctoring and possible fraud on a large scale. But in the course of doing this, I became acquainted with a scientist, a neuroscientist and physician at Vanderbilt University by the name of Matthew Schrag. And he would become ultimately a principal character in my book, Doctored. He's a guy who, young professor there at the time, and he was interested not just in his own work to try to understand the possible origins of the disease for the sake of his patients and also his ambition to do something useful as a researcher, but he also was deeply concerned after looking into this situation with Simufulum, the drug I mentioned before, and some of the basic research behind it that appeared to have been based on doctored images. And we can get into the details of what that means in a little while, but let me just bring through the story of how I jumped in. So I started talking with him in late 2021, and then by January of 2022, he had kind of broadened his horizons to look more broadly at some studies in the Alzheimer's realm. And in the process, he ran across and began to analyze a study that was published in 2006 in the journal Nature. And many of your listeners, I'm sure, will know that Nature, like the journal I work for, Science, is an eminent, important scholarly journal, one of the most important in the world. And when you have a study in Nature, just like Science and a handful of other journals, you are really hitting your mark and having influence. So, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
So what Dr. Schrag found in this study in Nature, this was a study written in 2000, just to set the stage for it. By 2006, there had been a period of time from the 90s into the early 2000s where a variety of remedies for Alzheimer's disease had been developed based on this idea, this central idea in the field about amyloid plaques being the progenitor of Alzheimer's disease. And so the idea is called the amyloid hypothesis of Alzheimer's. And I can explain it very simply because it's pretty easy to understand, really, in its basic elements. What the amyloid hypothesis says is that these sticky plaques and other toxic types of amyloid proteins begin a series of biochemical changes in the brain that ultimately cause some cell death and eventually the dementia that we consider a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. So it is the linchpin to the development of that disease, according to this hypothesis. And the difficulty by 2006 was that these drugs had been produced, and even a vaccine was produced against amyloid proteins that were able to remove these proteins from the brain, but had no beneficial effects on cognition. So
right.
They essentially attacked what was regarded as the central element, the linchpin of Alzheimer's. But because they weren't effective, it caused some discouragement and questioning and skepticism in the field about the validity of this so-called amyloid hypothesis. And so in 2006, something very important happened in the field. A study was done by scientists at the University of Minnesota. And this was a clever study that was one that really caught public attention and grabbed an enormous amount of mind share in the scientific community. And essentially what they did is that they worked with mice that were genetically engineered to produce copious amounts of amyloid proteins deposits in their mice brains. And they extracted some of that amyloid protein and specifically refined it to a certain subtype of amyloid protein called amyloid beta star 56. Their star protein, kind of what passes for a catchy name in the scientific world. And this clever name actually helped them gain additional mind share because it was easy to remember and easy to refer to in the scientific literature. And what they did is they took this star 56 protein, injected it into rats, and then described an experiment that suggested that the rats were having memory loss that was akin to what you might describe as memory loss that people experience in Alzheimer's. So what you had was the first cause and effect relationship between a particular substance and Alzheimer's symptoms, albeit in animals. But at this moment of discouragement for the amyloid hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease, it was a gigantically important thing. Yeah.
So Charles, you refer to this in the book as the amyloid mafia, which has been this dominant single theory that has been central to everything around Alzheimer's. And you're just saying that was the first real tangible connection between these proteins and dementia, correct?
It was the first sort of direct connection that people could identify and say, we have clear evidence that we are on the right path. And it helped allay the sense of discouragement that people in the field had been experiencing and redouble their efforts to depend on this hypothesis. And I might add, the federal government began to pour hundreds of millions of dollars and ultimately billions of dollars into the study of the particular type of amyloid protein that star 56 belonged to. It's a soluble form of amyloid protein. Unlike the sticky plaques, it's a type that kind of floats around in the fluid that bathes the brain. So there was this upswing in funding and in activity in that regard.
Yeah, and everyone just clung on to the amyloid hypothesis, and that, I guess this idea that everybody was clinging to this one thing led to some problems, right?
Yeah, well, and let me provide then a little bit of context about this, what you mentioned, the so-called amyloid mafia. This, of course, is not a real organization. It's a metaphor that I use in the book to help describe the dominance and the way in which the conventional wisdom was reinforced in the scientific community. The conventional wisdom being that the amyloid hypothesis was the true way to understand the disease and a singular way of understanding it. So people who were not adherents to that way of thinking, who had different ideas, and there are many ideas about what might be behind Alzheimer's dementia, found that they had enormous difficulty getting their research funded, found that at times they had to show allegiance or fealty to the general idea of amyloid removal from the brain as key to the disease, even if they were trying to work on other stuff. And some people actually had to change their career goals from working on Alzheimer's to working on other things because they simply didn't believe that that was the right way to go. But it was very powerful because big money was behind it, not just from the government, but from companies that were developing anti-amyloid drugs, certain antibody drugs. So these are like the human immune system, of course, produces antibodies to fight off viruses, bacteria, to keep us healthy. There's also these artificial antibodies that are produced in the lab and then infused normally into a person's vein that kind of mimic the human immune system and attacks whatever they're targeted against, in this case, amyloid proteins. And they can be very effective, again, at removing those proteins from the brain.
So the community really liked this hypothesis of amyloid, and it sounded like it was a bit of a cottage industry around amyloid and pharma being involved. And I guess perhaps there were pressures to align with this hypothesis. And going back to Dr. Schrag, he identified some irregularities. Is that right?
Yeah.
Let's pull it back to him and what he kind of uncovered.
Thank you. That's a good juncture to kind of provide what the big step was then. So we're talking about a conversation I was having with Schrag in 2022. This was in January 2022. And by that time, he had had a chance to closely examine this historically important study in Nature in 2006. And what he found was shocking and very disturbing to him. He found that a number of the images within that paper had been apparently doctored, apparently changed improperly to support the hypothesis of the experiment when the actual data didn't appear to support it. And I remember this conversation I had with him in January of 2022. We were both a bit stunned about it because we understood the potential gravity of that understanding and that finding. It would call into question something that had been, to a significant degree, steering the entire field a bit and encouraging similar research for years.
So take me through this. I guess this wasn't just this one 2006 Nature paper, right? He identified other irregularities in other studies, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, of course, he looked more broadly at the work of the scientists who were involved in this paper to understand whether this was a series of terrible errors, perhaps, at least giving them the benefit of the doubt, or possibly a pattern of behavior that could be demonstrated as a kind of set of techniques of altering experiments for a discernible purpose, namely to support a set of ideas that were not well supported by the actual results of the experiment. And he found pretty close to, I think it was about 20 papers that were from this one scientist, Sylvain Lesnay at the University of Minnesota, several of which were, including the very important Nature paper, were co-authored by, and in some cases senior authored by, his mentor, a scientist by the name of Karen Ash, who is an illustrious Alzheimer's scientist who has made many contributions to the field. However, in these cases, Schrag felt convinced that his findings called into question some key elements of that whole body of research. And of course, because it had been so widely adopted, thousands of citations in the scientific literature, hundreds and hundreds of experiments that were oriented in the same direction, many hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars of research, that it helped stimulate, not solely, but partially helped stimulate in the field. These were all factors that made Schrag realize how important it would be to bring this to public attention. And if it's okay, Brian, I'd like to explain then what I did, what my process as a journalist was to try to validate and understand his findings, because naturally for such an important thing, it was up to me to do my due diligence about his veracity and about the likelihood that his findings were well-founded.
So at this point, just to be clear in the story, he was, I guess, behind the scenes doing this. He hadn't gone public, right? He was having some conversation with you. You had been connected with him in some way. And he was telling you all this these remarkable stories, right? And that's where you were at.
Exactly right. And nothing had been made public at that time. No institutional authorities had yet been contacted, although I want to say clearly, even as I was beginning my due diligence, even as I was beginning the very elaborate reporting process I had to go through to feel comfortable that his findings were valid, he was already approaching the journal Nature and the NIH to make sure they understood right from the get-go that he had concerns that they might need to address. And of course, the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, as the funder of some of this work, it's sort of a key organization to bring into the loop. So then what I did is I validated his work in two ways. He ultimately created a dossier, which is a series of images from this Nature paper and a number of other papers by Lesnay, and some of which were co-authored by this woman, Karen Ash, that detailed image by image, paper by paper, where his concerns were in a way that was drawn up like a kind of an object lesson in how to examine these images. And so maybe now it would be a good place to take a small step back and say, what are we talking about? What are these images? Really, the case of Alzheimer's disease, most prevalently, there are two kinds of images that are subject to image doctoring. And one is something called micrographs, which many listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with. These are highly magnified images of, in this case, brain tissue. So you can see very minute features within the brain tissue, and they're often used to demonstrate the impact of a disease process or the impact of a treatment and how it results in changes or ways to understand the effects on the brain. And the second kind of images that were involved are something called Western blots. And these are a little bit more obscure, but they're very common in biomedical sciences, particularly in looking at things like Alzheimer's, that are thought to be based to a significant degree on proteins in the brain. And so what they do is they take a protein sample and they put it through a process that puts it through a certain gel using an electrical current. And it filters the proteins from the heaviest ones at the top to the lightest ones at the bottom. So it's like the kind of reverse of what you'd kind of expect from gravity. And through a photographic process, it allows you to display what you found. And so what it does is it displays in a kind of series of stacked bands, irregularly shaped bands, what type and concentration of proteins you have in your sample. So it's very important because if you're, for example, postulating that a particular protein, now star 56 refers to the protein's molecular weight, so pretty heavyweight protein. If you're postulating that star 56 is important in this sample, this tissue sample, then you have to be able to display it clearly in your Western blot. And what people have been shown to do over and over again was Schrag's assumption in this case is that people can do things like use programs like Photoshop to move things around within an image, to erase certain features that might be inconsistent with what you're expecting experimentally, to accentuate features by highlighting them with higher contrast or reducing the detail of features with lower contrast so as to make sure that the images better reflect ideas that are described in the paper. And by reverse engineering these things, Schrag was able to show over and over and over again in dozens and dozens of cases that there had been apparent image doctoring. And so what I did is I went out and I had his findings checked very thoroughly two ways. One is I went to some of the leading experts in forensic image analysis in the world and asked them if they felt that these analyses were well constructed and thoughtfully and incredibly done. And the response was not only had they been well constructed and incredibly done, but these experts also found additional questionable features in these same images. Second, I showed this dossier by Schrag along with a multitude of supporting materials to some top experts in Alzheimer's disease who understood the lab science well and asked their opinion about whether not just did these findings seem credible, but were they meaningful? And the answer again was yes, credible and meaningful. So this resulted in essentially the first big article that I did on this subject in Science magazine, which looked closely at this important experiment and some subsidiary work. And that came out in July of 2022.
Now, Schrag looked at a number of studies. I mean, what's the total number of studies that he's identified this sort of nefarious activity in? I know you targeted the 2006 Nature study and some others, but I guess this is far spread, right?
Yeah. So what happened after that is that I began to do a series of articles and then ultimately the book about this problem of possible image doctoring in Alzheimer's research. And I'm kind of jumping ahead quite a ways, but essentially what happened is that I was able to get assistance from a group of 4 forensic image experts. And this included Schrag, who is, again, himself a neuroscientist. This woman, Elizabeth Bick, who is perhaps the world's foremost expert in forensic image analysis in scientific papers. A guy by the name of Kevin Patrick, who is not a scientist, but he's just very adept with image analysis and has been doing it for many years and has been very successful at finding images that appear to have been doctored and getting scientific journals to correct or retract those papers. And finally, a scientist by the name of Mu Yang at Columbia University, who is also quite expert in these matters. And the four of them looked at literally many, many hundreds of papers. And as I describe in my book, Doctored, there were approximately 600 papers, many of them from leading scientists in the field who were instrumental in promoting and being behind some important developments in Alzheimer's research. Additionally, instrumental in being behind hundreds of patent applications and development and drug applications to FDA, and even drugs that have reached market to be treating patients with. And so these apparently doctored papers were profoundly important throughout the field and really forms a big part of the kind of general message I'm trying to bring to readers to understand the severity and range of problems in the field through my book.
I want to get to how widespread this is in just a moment, but I want to go back to Schrag for just a moment, because this struck me in the book when you were discussing your relationship with him in the time period before he went public. He was reticent about becoming a whistleblower, right?
He sure was, and for good reason. It's very, very hazardous to become a whistleblower for many people.
Young faculty member, right? Young scientist.
He didn't have tenure. He was contemplating going public for several months. We had many conversations about it. And just to be clear, I view it as my ethical responsibility as an investigative journalist to have these conversations with sources who might be running personal risks associated with their name being disclosed. It's very important to me because I want us to be able to sleep at night. But by the same token, it was very important to me for him to be named. And the reason was I knew that the only way to really get the sufficient attention on what I thought at the time and believe now was a very serious set of challenges and questions for Alzheimer's research was to tell the story through the eyes of the person who lived it. And that was Matt Schrag. And as a result, I really wanted him to say yes, but I only wanted him to say yes on his own terms. And he thought literally for 4 or 5 months about it before finally agreeing to do it. And the risks he was running was going up against his major funder and the major funder for most biomedical scientists and universities, the National Institutes of Health, leading journals where he needed to get his work published in order to further his career, illuminary figures in his field of Alzheimer's disease, and universities, including, the possibility of getting sideways with Vanderbilt, which was not that comfortable with people who would be speaking out on these issues. And I have to make it clear that none of this work was associated with his job as a professor there. He did it all in his own time, in his own way. So finally, as I describe in the book, he did agree to be a on the record whistleblower in these cases.
Now let's face it, you wanted to tell this story, right? And you needed him on your side, but I guess perhaps you felt this moral obligation to allow him to come to this on his own terms, correct? Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. Of course I wanted him to do it. Of course I was very happy when he decided to do it. And, again, he's a grown-up. He made his decision with eyes open. I made sure his eyes were open because we talked about the risks he was running in no uncertain terms.
Yeah, young guy, maybe not fully aware of the things that you see and you understand when these things go public, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we'll talk about Schrag in just a moment because there was some interesting fallout from this. But if you look at the 600 studies or the 600 studies that were analyzed, maybe there was some nefarious activity going on. Is this something that's limited to Alzheimer's research, or do you think this is symptomatic of a broader pattern of behavior within competitive research where in cancer and other realms where there's this kind of competition. You think this is going on? This is just the tip of the iceberg?
Well, thanks for that question, Brian. I think it's very important to set the context in that way. So the short answer is this is a human endeavor. And in every human endeavor, from plumbing to being a lawyer to being a doctor to being a scientist, there is a certain small percentage of people who are willing to cut corners or even at the extreme end engage in fraud. And of course, that's happening in these other scientific research areas like cancer and stroke and heart disease and diabetes and you name it. There's a lot of stuff on the record that shows that that's the case. There is a fundamental difference, though, that makes the Alzheimer's story both unique and also more tragic in regard to the deleterious effects of apparently doctored research in the field. And that is that unlike heart disease, unlike cancer, unlike diabetes, unlike stroke, there are no remedies available now that arrest or reverse the symptoms of the disease for Alzheimer's. Consequently, when doctored studies have the effect of skewing thinking in the field improperly, of slowing activity in other areas, and when you combine them with the prevalence and dominance of this singular idea, the amyloid hypothesis, and how powerful it's been, then you have a combination that can be very tragic in the result, which is that we're still waiting. We're still waiting for big progress in the disease that actually arrests the symptoms of cognitive decline.
You think these researchers began their journeys with the intent to defraud the public or the NIH? Or do you think this is in following with this desperation and feeling like they are doing righteous work and they just fudged things and then just went over the edge and just got used to adjusting images to correspond with what they believed their data represented? I mean, I'm trying to put a happy face on this. Make me feel better that these aren't all criminals?
Well, so I would say that human psychology is complicated and vast.
Yep, right.
So I think there's a range of characters and how I responded to this. But as you can imagine, I've thought about this long and hard because just like everyone else, I can't help but wonder what's going on inside these people's heads. How are they doing this? And my view is that it's very likely that it's a kind of a slippery slope where you start out and you do something that scientists call beautifying an image, and that might be to clip off little portions of it that just don't look quite right. You want to give it a little bit of curb appeal, you might say, for journal editors. And journal editors want truth and beauty in their pages. And this is something that people tend to look the other way about, even though it's strictly speaking not considered to be proper scientific practice. But then you might find a situation where you feel strongly in an experiment you're doing, and then you get a weak result. There's some sign that something's happening, but it's not super clear. Well, with image manipulation, you can slightly accentuate that. So to bring out that result in a way that is more vivid, and you think, I know this is a good result, so what's the harm? And that's...
In my heart, I know this is the right thing.
Exactly right. That is improper, but it so often is not caught by the institutional authorities that are the gatekeepers of knowledge, namely the journals. And consequently, people get away with it, and then they feel like they have a little license to take it to the next step and the next step. And I can't say whether people know in their hearts that they're committing fraud, or if they just feel like, well, these are good ideas, I'm just helping along. Either way, it's misconduct. It has to be stopped, and it misleads the field.
Absolutely. And it's obstructed perhaps decades of productive Alzheimer's research, as you, I think, point out in the book, right?
I think it has slowed the search for a real treatment that really benefits patients in a direct way, in a way that arrests or reverses the symptoms of the disease. Now, I'm sure some of your listeners are well aware that there are currently drugs on the market that in the last couple of years have been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. These are called anti-amyloid antibody drugs. And as I mentioned before, these are infused into a vein, and they have the effect of removing amyloid proteins from the brain, which they do very effectively, but they do not arrest the symptoms of cognitive decline. they're said to slightly slow the progression of cognitive decline. And so why is that not a great thing at face value? So look, I'm not a doctor, and anybody who's got a loved one or is personally contemplating the possibility of taking these drugs, I urge you to speak to your doctor and weigh the benefits and the risks. But just to be clear, there are very serious downsides to these drugs, potential downsides. These include brain swelling and bleeding that can occur associated with the side effects of these antibodies. And people have died from this, and people have had brain damage from this.
Mm-hmm.
So those are very real risks. And of course, not everybody has those symptoms. Many people have brain swelling or bleeding, but to a much more minor degree. So why not take the drugs? Well, if they were cheap and safe, I would say everyone with the disease should take them, even if there's only a small chance that you'll have a great effect from them. The actual benefit, many neurologists and neuroscientists say, is so subtle as to be imperceptible to many of the patients and families. And consequently, let's face it, whatever the merits of these drugs, and it's a long, complicated set of stories to understand whether their benefits have been well supported, and there's disagreements within the field about it. Whatever the benefits are, we know for sure that the benefits at best are extremely small and do not arrest cognitive decline. So you're talking about very expensive, potentially dangerous drugs that have, at best, a very minimal effect.
And for those listening, all of this is detailed in remarkable detail in Charles's book, Doctored. It reads like a thriller, in my opinion. It reminds me of Bad Blood. I couldn't put it down walking through it. So if you're hearing this and you're trying to make sense of it, the book does a wonderful job. One thing, Charles, that I was drawn to when I read Doctored was the technology used to uncover the malfeasance, and even the global collaborative effort of the data thugs who were played into this story. Could this have happened 25 years ago, or is this a function of the fact that we have these tools for identifying slightly fudged Western blots?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, Brian, and one that I try to emphasize when I can, which is that this is actually a very hopeful thing in the field, which is that because there has been developed a cottage industry of people who just really enjoy the thrill of understanding these images better and finding flaws, and because there are now AI programs that are very good at giving you a first pass at these images that can then need to be verified with human eyes. But you have tools, you have expertise, you have people all over the world who are now contributing to our understanding and identifying problems in studies that earlier would never have been seen and would potentially have misled the field. So that is a very important and, I think, a hopeful element to this story that has certainly very discouraging elements as well.
We sometimes refer to them as citizen statisticians or citizen scientists, who you describe this population of folks that love to get into the data on these studies and even identify irregularities. It's almost a personal quest, right?
It is. And there's a website that if people are interested in seeing what this all looks like, you can go to the website PubPeer, P-U-B-P-E-E-R. And PubPeer is a place where these forensic image sleuths, as they like to call themselves, post examples of issues that they're seeing. And, what they do, and I think this is very important to understand, is that they say, there seem to be some irregularities in this image. Can the author of the study explain whether there's something we're not noticing that's important to understand about this, or if necessary, correct or retract the paper? And the reason that they say apparent or probable image doctoring, rather than saying this is an example of fraud or some direct statement like that, is that often, in order to completely verify the issue that there is a problem with a set of images, is that you need to see the original uncropped high-resolution versions of these images and compare it to the published versions in the journals. And in my experience, and now just to be clear for my book, I reached out to 46 scientists that represent hundreds overall, because there are many collaborators on the papers of these 46 scientists and reached out to them repeatedly saying, can you give me the uncropped, high-resolution original images so that I can compare them with other experts to the published versions and try to understand whether the idea that images were doctored maybe just there was a mistake, or perhaps there was something that the image sleuths misinterpreted. And what I found over and over and over and over again is that almost no one will ever give the original images, because I think it shows that usually when you are in this situation and you don't have a good response, you don't have a good story to tell, you don't want to say anything. And that was my experience with most of these folks, including leading scientists in the field, I might add.
And beyond the technology that we discussed, social media and even investor activists fueled a lot of this broader story, or this drive to push the amyloid hypothesis or drugs for it, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, to some degree, that's true. There's a lot of people who are playing the stock market. It was more true in this drug Simufilm that I mentioned at the top of this conversation. That was what became a meme stock. I don't know if stock market investors in the audience would know, but basically it was promoted very heavily by small shareholders and by some big ones as well. And it became a very volatile stock that at one point reached a valuation of more than $5 billion, in part due to statements by the company that were later proved to be the result of improper activities that were acknowledged by the company after investigations by the Department of Justice and by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So that was a pretty bizarre example. Just to be clear, this drug was purportedly based on the idea that it would reduce amyloid deposits and other things within the brain that they described as being central to Alzheimer's disease. It was a multifactorial approach, again, that was proved to be useless, did not have any beneficial effects, but was postulated to have all these effects, including amyloid reduction.
Charles, since the release of Doctor, or even before that, with your original reporting in Science, obviously there have been reactions by the broader research community, or some of the researchers who were on these teams that weren't directly involved in the fraud. What kind of reactions have you seen to what you've uncovered?
Yeah, there's been some reaction. Some of the work that I did for the book appeared earlier in Science magazine. Let me just give you one example that I think is quite disturbing that speaks directly to your question. There's a guy who used to be the neuroscience director of the Division of Neuroscience at the National Institute on Aging, which is the part of the National Institutes of Health that is centrally responsible for funding neuroscience research, including Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other neurological conditions. And it has a multi-billion-dollar annual budget. And this guy was sitting at the pinnacle of that. He had previously been an eminent researcher at the University of California, San Diego. He has published more than 800 scholarly papers, many of which were among the most cited in the world about Parkinson's and Alzheimer's diseases. So basically, he was one of the most influential scientists. And he was then hired in 2016 to be the director of this neuroscience division. So he was responsible for helping steer the entire agenda of the nation, because NIH helps really set that agenda for how to tackle these diseases. And so as part of the project for Doctored, this team of image sleuths who I mentioned earlier, Schrag, Elizabeth Bick, Kevin Patrick, and Mu Yang, who actually took the lead role in examining the papers of Eliezer Maslia as part of our overall project, they developed a dossier that ran to 132 papers, 300 pages. It's not that they examined every one of Maslia's papers, but at some point they said, okay, we've made our point. 300-page dossier, paper after paper, image after image, that appeared to have been based on either doctoring or improper reuse of images across papers published in different journals at different times. So a degree of seriousness that is mind-boggling for this person in this top leadership post. So I went to, of course, my normal process and that of any responsible investigative reporter is to, not blindside anyone. Of course, weeks in advance of the article being published in Science, I went to Maslia. I went to his bosses at NIH, including the director of NIH, Monica Bertagnolli at the time, and I asked them to review the materials. I gave them everything. I gave them a set of questions that were so clear that they knew everything that would be in the article. And I did not get any response from Maslia. I could not get any interview with anyone at NIH or NIA. And ultimately what happened was the agency, at the very last minute, after the story had been pretty much locked down, they contacted me to say, we'll have something for you soon. What they had was that on the day my story appeared, he was no longer the director of that division because they had looked at 2 of his papers. Now, remember, in the book, we looked at 132. They looked at 2 of his papers, found misconduct, and he was no longer in that job. So what we're talking about is a mind-boggling situation with this guy in a leadership position in the field having this situation. Now, Brian, if you'll forgive me, I would really like to just diverge slightly to talk more generally about the institutional authorities of science in the current period we're in. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, let me make it clear that I have written very critically of the NIH in my book and in numerous articles over the years. And I have written very critically of the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates our drug supply. I have written very critically of the performance of universities in certain circumstances. And I have written very critically of the degree to which scholarly journals have been able to protect and monitor possible misconduct that leads to improper information becoming part of the scientific record. That said, I just want to say very clearly, I think these 4 institutional authorities of science, the NIH, the FDA, the universities, and the journals, are incredibly important to so many wonderful developments and improvements in our lives and in scientific knowledge. While I have been critical of many things that they've done, and I think people have the right to demand that they up their game, that they get much better at detecting these kinds of problems and preventing them from influencing important regulatory or funding or research kinds of developments. Of course, we have to demand that they do better. But what we do not want to do is lose sight of the fact that these are critically important. And right now in Washington, D.C., there's an effort underway to remove a lot of their institutional knowledge by firing important officials, laying off many important people in these agencies. There's also a desire to kind of retrench and not support research in the same way or to the same degree. I just want people to know that I think these are extremely wrong-headed moves that really ignore the possibility of just enforcing better ways of improving these agencies' performance without destroying the elements of them that are so critical to scientific understanding and to the safety and development of our drug supply.
You want a more measured approach to handling this kind of situation, right?
I do. I think there are very specific things that can be done that would improve the situation, and that implementing those could go a long way towards obviating some of the problems that were identified and doctored, short of destroying the organizations in the process, of course.
I have to admit, Charles, as being part of a large academic organization and having been a physician involved in bench research earlier on in my career, I was angered by what I read here, and I kind of felt like these organs, the NIH, the FDA, the journals, and maybe even the institutions have failed us, right? And why couldn't they self-correct? And why did Schrag, when he was approaching these journals, why did he get no response, or why did you get no response? There is an outrage internally that I think needs to happen, right?
I would agree with you, Brian. And let me give you a couple of examples of things that I think can and should be fixed that do not involve removing funding or having a gigantic change in the organizations per se. let's start with the university. So when allegations of misconduct occur, usually what happens is that it becomes the responsibility of the home university of the person who is thought to have possibly engaged in misconduct to handle the investigation. And so what you're doing is you're placing this responsibility in the hands of an institution that has the most to lose and the least to gain from doing a prompt, aggressive, and publicly accessible examination of possible misconduct. The conflicts of interest mean that you almost never get really good results from that. Job one would be to give those responsibilities to independent authorities. The second thing that I would say is that journals and the NIH need to get much more serious about examining submissions for possible image doctoring. And they can do that. There are tools, AI tools, that make that job a lot easier these days. And I might add that, look, I work for a journal, Science, that, is imperfect, just like all human endeavors, and has had a history of finding some of these problems. But Science, like many major journals these days, is beginning to fully implement this check on images as part of their core responsibility. And the degree to which that continues will be very, very important for cleaning up and adding additional reliability to the body of knowledge that we regard as important in science.
That's a great summary of what we may need to do. My original question was going to be, Elon Musk is driving around his Tesla and reads your book and wants to hire you to help straighten things out. And so that's a tall order, but I think you summarized a lot of it really nicely. Hey, will we ever be able to trust the research community? After reading this book, or if I was a less educated reader, you look at these decades of hype and fakery and fraud, give me some hope that we're going to, that there will be trust in our ability to sort of tackle these major diseases. Is there some light of hope here?
I think so. Look, we have to understand that medical science, as you probably know far better than I, has advanced dramatically in recent decades. What we need to fight against is certain ideas that might drag us backwards. And so, we have a new HHS Secretary, RFK Jr., who is a vaccine skeptic. And I think this is an example of proven science that has been one of the most valuable developments in the history of medical science. To go backwards on our confidence in vaccines, I think, would be a tragedy. And so we need to fight aggressively against ideas that would take us backwards. But we also need to insist that these medical institutions, the research community, up their game and become better at reassuring the public and really show a bit of humility. And look, I think it's pretty clear that if these organizations and these institutional authorities of science can say what's obvious to everyone, that mistakes have been made, that they take them seriously, that they're going to institute reforms to improve their performance, that will go a ways towards reassuring the public that they're not just ignoring things that are so critical to the way in which public confidence either is decayed or is improved in society. And so I think that those would be good steps in that direction.
Charles, I have to admit, we didn't discuss this earlier on, but I lost my own mother to dementia, not Alzheimer's, but vascular dementia. And I can attest to the fact that the desperation felt by family members when watching your mother or father just disappear, it's easy to see how a lot of what you described can be fueled by this sense of desperation from the bottom up. And I think that was what drew me to read your book to begin with. And it's just an amazing story. I would strongly encourage everyone to grab a copy, and it reads very, very quickly. It reminds me of Bad Blood, the story of the Theranos debacle, but it's just beautifully written and an important message. How can people reach you, Charles? Or find you rather.
Sure, yeah. I think the easiest way is to go to my website, charlespiller.com. It has all of my contact information. I welcome feedback, and I welcome tips and ideas for things that people think are important. Brian, I wonder if I could just say one more thing that might try to end this conversation on a slightly more optimistic note.
Sure. And I hope I haven't been pessimistic. I just was
No,
You
no,
know,
no, no. Look, it's on me, Brian. There's some somewhat discouraging things that I've written about, but I also try to remind people that there's a lot of really interesting, innovative stuff going on in the field. And I think that there are, even though the conventional wisdom of Alzheimer's has been somewhat discouraging in recent years, there have been some new developments that I think are quite interesting. One is the development of ideas behind these GLP-1 inhibitors. These are the seemingly miraculous weight loss drugs like Wegovy and others that have taken the world by storm. And there's some evidence that they may be beneficial in preventing or treating Alzheimer's dementia. And there's clinical trials going on right now that we may see results from in a year or so that might establish whether that's a fruitful avenue to travel. The other is that there's thinking that viruses, perhaps latent viruses like herpes virus that can hang out in the brain for years or decades after the outward lesions of the disease go away, might have a role to play. There's, again, clinical trials to treat that disease that could bring new information to the table that some people see as central to understanding the multifactorial aspects of Alzheimer's disease. And finally, let me just say that if you or a loved one are experiencing early signs of dementia or just concerned about it, we have agency in our lives. There's no magic pill or food supplement or brain game that is a preventive against Alzheimer's disease per se. But by watching your risk factors for the disease, things like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, eating a very healthful diet, getting enough exercise, these are all things that we can live our best lives and benefit from that, and also possibly forestall some of the worst aspects of Alzheimer's should you be unlucky and be someone who has that disease later in life.
that's solid advice, Charles. Something we can all learn from. The book is Doctored: Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's rather. Charles Pillar. Just an amazing bit of work, and the story behind the book is just remarkable. And the work you do as an investigative journalist is so important in advancing science in the right way, and we appreciate everything that you've done for sure.
Thank you so much, Brian.
I look forward to maybe doing some follow-up or catching up with you again.
Let's do that.